Lawmakers are expected to fast-track work on the Real ID this session. In 2005, Congress enacted the Real ID Act, which requires states to comply with federal standards when issuing sources of identification, such as a driver's license. The issue came to the forefront recently when Minnesotans learned that their driver's license may not allow them to board a plane in the future. I recently sat down with Senator Warren Limmer to talk about Real ID. He strongly advocates that lawmakers use caution in adopting the federal requirements. Just to be clear, Minnesotans can purchase an ID for an additional $15 that is in compliance.
That is a good point to start from.
Okay.
Minnesotans can buy an enhanced driver license provision for their driver license. Costs $15. You have to bring in some proof of citizenship or a birth certificate. That's the beginning elements of Real ID. Okay. And it'll be on your driver license either through an encrypted chip or a magnetic stripe on the back. I don't think that technology has been perfected yet, but it's certainly there as an option in the future. But and the other thing that I want to make sure people know is that they can board airplanes until 2018.
Right.
So we don't need to overrun our legislative offices saying you must do something until we begin to scrutinize it a little bit.
So I've read a lot of concerns, both from lawmakers and from the public, about Real ID. What are some of your concerns?
My concerns are, first, the process that Real ID began, how it began in Congress. In 2005, Congress passed the Real ID bill, which would require every state to have a uniform technological card, and then the states print their driver license print on it, and it would be a uniform access point, a digital access point for the federal government. The information on that could include, or would include, your birth certificate or proof of citizenship, among other things. And every state in the country would have access to Minnesota's records, as we would have access to theirs. Now, there's a conflict in law. Minnesota highly protects. We're a very strong privacy state, and we protect that data from being distributed to anyone else in our state or outside of our state. The federal government requires we can share that information with anyone we choose in any other state in the union. That violates our privacy law. And if they in turn did something wrong with that information, we have no way to enforce our privacy law in protecting our citizens once that information goes beyond our borders. The other thing about it is we're creating a centralized database that can be expanded at any time by Homeland Security. When Real ID was passed, now keep in mind, it was passed in the dead of night, 2:30 in the morning in Congress by a simple amendment. There was no committee scrutiny, there was no committee consideration, no discussion. It was just brought forward as an amendment on the floor of the House and later adopted in its entirety by the Senate. It didn't even have a roll call vote on the amendment. But it is such a sweeping change in our driver license laws. It's a federal intrusion into what we should consider via the 10th Amendment as a responsibility we do, not the federal government. But regardless of how it was passed in Congress, now Homeland Security wants us to quickly pass the Real ID provisions as quickly as we can. And we were rather surprised in January that they now have extended it to 2018.
Right. Well, currently Minnesota can't even speak of the Real ID because of a law in 2009, which you were part of.
Yep. We did that for a reason.
What was the reason?
The reason is in 2009, we had 200 of the 201 legislators all supporting my bill as we joined 32 other states to say no to the federal government regarding Real ID sanctions. Since then, one by one, they've been picked off by the federal government and threatened with, we will refuse to have your citizens board airplanes if you don't bend to our will.
Right.
I have a little resistance just about that type of way of laws
because they're
being
strong-arming the
We
state.
had no discussion in Congress. It was passed without a roll call vote. Now they want to force us and bend our arms to bend the knee to the federal government. All in violation of Minnesota's existing privacy laws.
Right.
And so I know that this legislature will more than likely vote for some kind of way to pass it in the future, probably this session. Even though we have 2 years to do it,
right.
They will want to get this off the table and behind them at some point, probably this session.
So yeah, I mean, that was my question is, do you think it will be repealed this session? And then how can you move forward from there?
Yeah, I think it will be passed, and then we don't need to progress any further because it was passed.
Right.
But getting back to the reason why the agencies should not discuss it, we in 2009, when we had almost unanimous support of staying away from the federal government, we wanted to make sure that the legislature, not the bureaucrats, not the administration, not rulemaking that's outside of the public discussion, once again, just like Congress, we wanted to make sure that we, the office holders who are responsible to the people back home, are held accountable to making that decision. And if it's a good idea, it's a good idea, but let's keep it on the public record so the public knows who's responsible for including Minnesota in the Real ID program.
Besides lack of privacy or the privacy issue, are there any other unintended consequences that you fear?
Well, there is, and namely in the federal law of Real ID, it is written into the federal law that the Homeland Security Director, whoever he or she may be in the future, can have the single authority to expand the function and use of the Real ID digital platform whenever they want. Congress is out of it. Once again, Congress is out. There will be no voice of the people as represented through the action of Congress, who represents all of the people across the United States. They will be out of it, and Homeland Security will be in. Keep in mind, Homeland Security Director is a political appointment of the White House and not a representative of the public. And so we have to be very careful about the process that we follow when we write laws. Accountability is vitally important on this type of issue.
Do you know, I'm just curious, do these requirements hold forth for all state-issued IDs or just for driver's licenses? So people who don't drive, if they have just a state-issued ID, does it still have to have that in order for them to board a plane?
It will be applied to all state driver licenses or identification cards. We print those for people who don't drive but still need some form of government recognized identification card.
You've been watching an interview with Senator Warren Limmer, who urged lawmakers to use caution in meeting the requirements of the Federal Real ID Act. Senator Scott Dibble, chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, also sat down with me to talk about meeting the federal requirements. So you were part of the 2009 law prohibiting any discussion of Real ID.
Right.
What were your concerns then, and have your views changed since then?
Well, I was one of almost all the legislators in the entire legislature, all but one, I think, who voted to enact that prohibition on planning for and implementation of Real ID. And the concerns were shared by lots of state legislators around the country. A number of states took that same action. And the concerns were several. One was the fact that this was enacted by Congress without any consultation with states. It was done by amendment, kind of under the dark of night, and it had a lot of implications and questions that went unanswered around, security and data privacy and, appropriate levels of access by government into, what basically amounts to private data. What are the safeguards against security breaches? How much is this going to cost? All of our states, no dollars followed those requirements, those sorts of things, and the effort to enact the prohibition was an effort to introduce some leverage into a negotiation with the federal government to maybe gain some concessions around these ideas and have a better craft law. Everyone believes that security is a good thing and improving security is a good thing. And we shared that goal, but we wanted to really deal with some of these considerations. My views are continue to be the same. We actually have gained some ground, not as much as I would like. So when we do take up this effort to repeal the prohibition, we're going to have to put in some things in place that address people's concerns.
Right, and so are there unintended consequences that you fear if the 2009 law is overturned and we move forward and it's implemented and therefore Minnesota does comply? Are there unintended consequences that you foresee?
Well, for sure, we're going to be put to a lot of expense that we wouldn't otherwise, and I think it's a shame that the federal government isn't helping us pay and defray for that as much as they should. They are doing more than they were back then, so that was a little bit of a success. But you know, who's going to bear that cost? It's either going to be, you know, the people who are buying their driver's license, or the taxpayers, you know, out of the general fund, or something like that.
So it's possible that the cost of a driver's license may increase.
May increase, you know,
Okay.
yeah, or we'll just kind of broadly distribute it broadly, you know, and have it shared by all taxpayers to the general fund. We haven't figured that out yet.
Okay.
I do think that we really, I mean, I don't know for sure, but you know, we do need to know for sure before this is all said and done what the kind of the data privacy concerns are, and what the provisions are for ensuring against data breaches, because we could become less secure if these databases that get linked up with each other state to state, you know, kind of in a quasi-federal database of everyone's identification, are breached, and that happens. You know, we had a whole fingerprint database that was breached just a few months ago. So what are the protections against misuse of the information by the government itself, and intrusions from external coming into and stealing that data?
One of the concerns Senator Limmer mentioned was that the Department of Homeland Security head person is an elected or an appointed official, meaning it's somewhat of a political appointment. Does that also concern you too, that there, like, you know, there could be that sort of access?
I'm not so concerned about that. I trust that the Secretary of Homeland Security is going to be a professional on into the future, whether appointed by, you know, president or you know, of a Republican or Democratic party. You know, there's a vetting and confirmation process. So I'm not as concerned about that. What I am concerned about is a provision in the law that says that the director or the Secretary of Homeland Security can designate a purpose for Real ID of their own choosing with no limitation, and just make it so. And you know, sky's the limit there. So I hope the law that we do pass says, should the purpose of the Real ID be designated for something that we don't know about today, we're going to take that back under consideration at the state level and make a determination at the state level whether or not that's appropriate for our purposes as well.
So a friend of mine who flies frequently just carries their passport. They're still concerned that they're going to have trouble boarding a plane. And just to be clear, Minnesotans can already purchase for an additional $15 the enhanced qualifications for their driver's license.
Right.
Would you recommend that Minnesotans take those extra precautions now, even though we have until January 2018, or do you think they're maybe worrying needlessly?
I think people at this point are worrying needlessly. I think we're going to come into compliance with Real ID in plenty of time, and actually I think the final hammer drops in 2020. So we'll have 4 years to come into full compliance. We'll get an extension, we'll get a waiver, et cetera, as we make good faith progress towards compliance. And so I don't think anyone needs to rush out and pay for the enhanced driver's license, which is the driver's license that lets people cross the Canada border and the Mexican border, as well as, by the way, Caribbean countries and Bermuda, or carry their passport. That's just not necessary. So people who are really worried about their ability to travel domestically on airlines don't need to worry so much. I think we're going to get this done, and certainly we don't have anything to worry about for a couple of years.
Right, until 2018. So do you expect that this will be one of the first things that comes up when session starts?
I anticipate what will happen is we'll pass an initial bill, which will get the Department of Public Safety on the path of gathering the data, communicating with the Department of Homeland Security, preparing some information for us in order to pass a second bill, which then is kind of the full authorization and deals with all of these policy issues that we need to contend with. You know, what are we going to do for people who don't want to be a part of the national database, which is not a national database, but all our databases will be linked up to each other. People who want what we're calling a liberty license, kind of in a joking fashion, but people who want a non-compliant, kind of second-tier, non-compliant license that can be used only for the purposes of driving in the state of Minnesota. You wouldn't be able to use that license to get on an airplane, but if you opt for that license, you can have that. We need to button up some details in our own laws that would not allow us to comply in other parts of the law. We need to figure out how we're going to pay for it. There's a complicated discussion around deputy registrars. We have, private offices that issue driver or take in all of the applications for driver's licenses, motor vehicle titles, that sort of thing. We call those deputy registrars, and there's a whole complicated set of issues around whether they can receive the documents in secure enough fashion, and do they have some expenses that they're going to go to that we need to provide for. We have just a lot of stuff that we need to deal with.
So there's a lot to discuss and more to come.
Right.
Thank you for joining me today, Senator.
Great. Thanks, Shannon.